living power come flood this place and fill the atmosphere.
Well, good morning. I'm here at the lovely Howard Estate, right off of Watson Road. Shelley, our newly appointed, self-appointed artistic director, thought it'd be a good idea to do this early in the morning, and I thought, you know what, I think she's right. And so we're enjoying this. Jeff is here with me. We're right next to a fire, and the sun is just coming up, which makes complete sense, because that's where our story starts. As we read the story of Jesus' resurrection in Luke's Gospel, I'm convinced God's going to do a couple things in our hearts. One, He's going to expose, He's going to let us know where our hearts are and where Jesus wants to take our hearts. But then He's also going to speak to us about how the resurrection of Jesus, our ultimate destiny and our everyday hope depends on Jesus. And the fact that He is not dead, but He is alive. And we celebrate that this morning. So listen to Luke's account in chapter 24 of Jesus. And listen to the hearts, the different hearts and the different perspectives as we read Luke's Gospel. On the very first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the tomb, they found the stone, and it was rolled away from the tomb. And when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. But while they were looking about this, they were wondering. Suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them, and in their fright the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, He is risen. Remember how He told you while He was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." And then they remembered His words. And when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the other disciples. And it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them, and who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb, and bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. And then Luke tells us that Jesus finds himself on the road to a city called Emmaus with 2 other people, and they didn't know that they were talking to Jesus, and he asked them what they were talking about, and they began to tell him about the events of the day and how Jesus had been crucified and how the body was not been found at the tomb. And little did they know they were actually walking and talking with Jesus. And so we pick up the conversation where Jesus speaks to them after they had just told him that there had been a death and a resurrection, but they hadn't found the body. And Jesus says to them in verse 25, He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow you are to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter His glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the other prophets, He explained to them what it was said in all the scriptures concerning Himself. And as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if He were going further. But they urged Him strongly, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening. The day is almost over." And so He went in to stay with them. And when He was at the table with them, He took bread and He gave thanks, and He broke it, and He gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized Him, and He disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, "Are not our hearts burning within us while He talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Luke tells us about a couple different hearts in this story. The first are wondering hearts. Both the women and Peter were wondering. They had questions. This was even after 3 years of being with Jesus and Him telling them about what was going to happen, and even some very recent reminders. Even with all of that, they were still wondering. They still had questions. So if you're wondering, if you have questions about this whole thing of Jesus and the resurrection and how it makes sense, you're in good company. And I want you to know that Jesus is not offended by your questions. He is not put off by your questions. In fact, He loves wondering hearts. He loves when people question and think. And you know what? I want you to realize that Jesus doesn't put you off. He doesn't stiff-arm you when you have questions and when you're wondering. I'd love you to imagine that if you have questions and you really would love to talk with Jesus, that he would love to sit down with you at your favorite coffee shop with a couple of your favorite beverages right in front of you, and you're looking into his eyes and you see a softness and you see a receptivity to your questions and to your honest thinking that completely surprises you. That's how Jesus wants to engage with you about your questions. And if you're wondering some very important things about who he is and about this resurrection thing, he wants you to know that he is loving you in this. He embraces you. He draws you close. Some of you, everybody knows you have questions. You're very open about your questions. Your friends know it. Your family knows it. But some of you are like Peter. Luke tells us that Peter went away wondering to himself. Some of you, even as I'm here, you've been walking with the Lord for a long time. You know him, but you still have questions. And maybe you're afraid. You're just a little shy to admit that you actually do have questions. But please don't. Please let somebody know those questions. Please let friends know that you're wondering. You do have questions. And either way, whether everybody knows you have questions or whether you're the only one that knows your questions, Jesus knows them, and know that he loves you. And he says, would you please let me move your heart to a different place? The other heart that Luke tells us about is a remembering heart. Even after they had asked these questions, the angels remind the women and Peter about what Jesus has said, and even later with the apostles, they remembered what Jesus had said, and they said, yes, that's true. And maybe this is your heart this morning. Maybe you've heard some of these stories before. You've heard the gospel accounts. You've heard about Jesus and the resurrection. Maybe as a kid, maybe from a grandparent, but maybe you've forgotten some of these important aspects of the resurrection, or maybe you've just dismissed them like the apostles did as nonsense. And maybe this morning the Spirit of God is just whispering to you, it's time for you to reconsider some of what you might have dismissed. It's time for you to remember again some of these accounts of Jesus. And maybe your heart is stirred to maybe check out again some of the reasons why so many people have followed Jesus for so long. And they have satisfied minds and they have satisfied hearts in the middle of their questions and their wonderings. Maybe this is the day that the Lord spurs you to move from wondering to maybe reconsidering and thinking again about the reality and the hope of the resurrection. But then Jesus says to the two people that he's speaking to on the road, he says, you know what? You guys are slow to believe. And I thought, ouch, that would be hard to hear from Jesus. And what Jesus is basically saying, from what they've even told him themselves, is you have the evidence of the prophets. You have the evidence of all the scriptures. You have the evidence that the body has not been found. There's more than enough evidence in your mind and your thinking. You just have been slow to believe. And maybe that is where your heart is this morning. You've known all this. You have many inputs to your life, and you know you really don't need any more information. You've just been slow to believe. And maybe you're at a new place where there's a slowness in your heart to really trust and believe what Jesus has been saying to you. If this is the case, I really encourage you to read again Isaiah 53. There's a lot of good books out there. There's a lot of good things that you could expose yourself to. But I encourage you to take a look at Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament and just read that over several times. And then read the gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And then just quietly listen. What is your heart saying as you read Isaiah's prophecy written over 600 years before the crucifixion and resurrection, and then read this account in the Gospels, and then listen. And maybe then you would ask Jesus also to say, Jesus, would you please move my heart to a new place? The last heart that Luke tells us about in the lives of these two people as they sat with Jesus were burning hearts. It says, Luke tells us that their eyes were opened, they recognized Jesus, they remembered his words, and their hearts were burning. And it's not a stretch to say that their hearts were burning with hope, because the Apostle Peter links hope with resurrection. He says, because of the mercy of God, we are born to a living hope because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so maybe this is the first time that you've considered Jesus. Maybe you have not had a long history with this whole thing of the resurrection of Jesus, and maybe you're for the first time hearing him speak to you about where he wants to move your heart to a burning heart. But maybe this is the 63rd time. I've heard this gospel account at least 63 times, and probably 2 and 3 times that over the course of my life. But my family, myself, we need fresh hope because of the resurrection like we have never needed it before. Because it was just about 21 days ago, right about this time in the morning, we were still at Loudon Hospital because my father-in-law had just passed into the presence of Jesus. Jim Reed was not just a builder, even though 45 years ago he became my boss. I worked for him for in between college years and then 2 or 3 years full-time as a carpenter's helper. But then 37 years ago, he gave me the greatest gift any man could give any other man, and that is his daughter. And I've been so grateful for his gift of Cindy to me for these 37 years. But then 10 years ago, we became roommates. He and Ruthie moved in, and I became his landlord. And so we got to know each other on a whole new, different level. And so one of the things that happened is our youngest daughter, Anna, would go down and spend a lot of time with Medium Jimmy and Ruthie. You see, he was Medium Jimmy because in earlier days he had been Big Jimmy, but he hadn't quite got to Little Jimmy. So Anna named him Medium Jimmy. Anna loved Medium Jimmy, still does love Medium Jimmy. And so how did Cindy and Karis, our older daughter, speak to Anna after Medium Jimmy wasn't there, and even after she tapped on his arm at one point when he was still going through his last hours, and just saying, I tried all I could. I tried everything I could to have him wake up, and he didn't. How do we speak to her? And it was a depth of joy, a depth of certainty in our hearts, as Cindy and Karis and I looked into her eyes, and still do, and say that Medium Jimmy is living. He is more alive now than he's ever been, and that she will see Medium Jimmy again. And we know that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And it was so good for Karis and Cindy and I to look into Anna's eyes and be able to speak with that kind of certainty about how Anna is going to know and see Medium Jimmy again. And it has everything to do with the reality and the hope of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're hoping that Anna has the same confidence that Job had. Job's book was written a couple thousand years before the resurrection. Listen to what Job wrote by the inspiration of the Spirit of God. Job writes this in chapter 19. I know my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. We know and we hope and pray that Anna has that same hope of seeing Medium Jimmy again. I've been asking God to do this in me, even though I've walked with him for probably 50-some years at this point. I'm asking him to work in me a very fresh sense of hope of the resurrection. Maybe the first time that you're asking God to work in you a fresh reality of the hope of the resurrection. I've been asking God to do this in me. I've been asking and praying for him to do this in you. I've been asking him to do this in the millions of people around this globe that are dealing with this coronavirus, and some have lost dear loved ones. Some are struggling. Some are walking through some of the last days. This is a very difficult, unprecedented time, and I have been praying that God, by the power of his Spirit, in some strong, miraculous, mysterious way, would bring a fresh hope of the resurrection around this globe to millions of people, even this Easter morning, even this resurrection morning. So if you're wondering this morning, if you have questions, I've been praying that God would move your heart, that Jesus would move your heart. But if you're remembering some of these things and realize that you've just dismissed some of them, and I'm praying that Jesus would move your heart to a point of belief. And maybe some of you this morning have had more than enough information, but you've just been slow to believe. And I've been praying that Jesus moves your heart to that place in Emmaus, around that table, with Jesus, where you're looking into the eyes of Jesus, you're listening to him, and all of a sudden you realize that your heart is burning. It's warm, it's responsive, it is saying a deep yes to Jesus. I pray that that happens in your heart in a fresh way. Last Ash Wednesday, I put a dead seed into a plastic cup with some dirt, and I watered it. And I basically said, okay, God, this is a dead seed. There's nothing here. You've got to do your thing. And sure enough, look at this. It's a little limpy this morning, I think, because it's cold, but I need to get a longer pencil. But we're gonna bury this thing. We're gonna put this in the ground today, because this is a visual reminder to me of what God can do. He can bring new life, and he can even bring hope, fresh hope. To our lives. And maybe you're here this morning and there's just nothing there. There's a death in your heart, and there's a grief in your heart, and Jesus can bring fresh hope. And maybe you've got questions, and you've got some deep grief, and you're pretty discouraged. He can bring some fresh hope to you even this morning. God is growing hope. He's bringing life, and he can do it in your life. He's done it in my life in a fresh way, and I pray that he does it in yours. May it be so. I'd like to pray. I'd like to finish our time this morning with just a brief word of prayer for you. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the resurrection of Jesus. Father, I pray that Jesus, I pray that you would move hearts wherever they are. I pray that you would move every heart listening to my voice right now, to that place around that table in the city of Emmaus, where we're sitting around a table with Jesus. We're looking into his eyes. He's opening up his word to us, and our hearts are burning with the reality of fresh hope of what you can bring to us, Jesus. Please do that again in a new way in my heart, as you have. Please do it in every heart that's listening even now. And I pray this in the precious, the powerful name of our risen Jesus. Amen. As many early Christians would say when they would see each other, they would leave and they would just say, he is risen. And I say that to you, Jeff Howard, this morning. He is risen. And what do you say?
He is risen indeed.
Amen. Go in the power and the fresh hope of the resurrection of Jesus. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Your glory, God, is what our hearts long for, to be overcome by your